What is up, fam? Zach Beckwith here from Path to Self Wellness Center. I want to thank you guys for stopping by. This is where all the magic happens. We have our boxing group training, we have our functional strength training classes, yoga, personal training, physical therapy services, but most importantly, tune in to Path to Self podcast for all the raw truth. Path to Self podcast for all the raw truth. What is up, fam? I'm your host, Zach Beckwith, and welcome to Path to Self podcast, where we do more unlearning than we do learning. Join me while we dismantle conditioned beliefs and illusions that keep us stuck, sick, and profitable, while we provide a more empowering and holistic approach to health and wellness. Welcome to episode number 3 of our podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you enjoyed the first 2 episodes. This is another solo episode, and I'm hoping to get into bringing some guests on. That is definitely coming down the pipeline, so be ready for that. Today's episode, we're going to go over 10 ways that the medical establishment lies to you, or 10 ways that the medical establishment, or what I like to call the medical cartel, misleads you. I think that's a better way of putting it. When I think about how we get misled by the medical establishment, I think of a certain tactic that we see be used in many different ways amongst the mainstream. We see it in war, we see it in medicine, we see it on television, and it's a means of control. And this tactic that's used on us is called problem, reaction, solution. So what we see is a problem is created, which leads to a reaction from the public, which leads to a solution. So just like in our last podcast episode where I went over the origins of mainstream medicine and we went into depth on John D. Rockefeller and how he started to bring forth his petroleum-based drugs, which were found to lead to cancer and other diseases. And then he founded the American Cancer Society and was able to then further profit from the original problem, which was the petroleum-based medicine, which is still the archetypal medicine of today. So that's just one instance of problem, reaction, solution, where they create the problem, which is petroleum-based drugs, which gets a reaction, which is symptoms, cancer, and disease, which they then come forth with the solution. This is seen so often in the medical world, especially the mainstream medical world. Another way that this comes forth is, for instance, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola spends massive money and pays out the big pharma in order to be able to push their sugary, poisonous drugs, which is soda, to us. And since they fund Big Pharma does not talk about how all of these things, or at least not enough. I'm not going to say that they don't talk about it, because I think most of us know that sugary drinks and sodas like Coca-Cola lead to diabetes and obesity. But we're gaslit on it. Just point blank period. We're gaslit on the fact that things like Coca-Cola lead to diabetes and other diseases like obesity and an assortment of other things, all because they are being paid out by these companies. And that's just one example. Another one, Johnson & Johnson with their baby powder. We're putting known carcinogens in their baby powder, which is causing disease amongst our children. And then those same companies produce the drugs that will treat, not cure, but treat the symptoms that are created from the products, that company's first product. This is problem, reaction, and solution. And so you'll see amongst these 10 ways that we're misled by the medical cartel, you'll see this problem reaction solution come up. And I hope that you start to notice the patterns and start to notice how this shows up for us, because it shows up so much. And it's how a lot of laws and different things come into play, where the establishment will create a problem, it instills fear, and then they create the solution, much like the pandemic. You know, they created an environment that led to further disease, which led to obviously the disease, and then they provide the solution, which is the vaccine. Let's get into cause versus correlation. Cause versus correlation is going to show up a lot amongst these 10 ways that we're misled. This shows up quite often. I'm going to do a little example here. If I take out a stinky garbage, I go toss it out in the sun. 4 or 5 days later, we see flies flying around that garbage. Is it accurate for me to assume that the flies caused the garbage? Obviously not. And with that being said, you know, this is how they use cause and correlation to try to prove something causes disease when in fact it's just a correlation. I'll do another simple example. We see firefighters present at fires. Is it accurate for me to assume that firefighters cause fires? Absolutely not. And we need to start to think like this, because we're going to go through these 10 ways that we're misled. And this is just 10 of so many. But for the sake of time for this podcast, we're not going to get into all of them. But really start to notice how we're misled, how we're lied to about the cause and the correlation. Something may be correlated, but it's not the cause. Before we get into those 10, I want to talk about a little fish tank experiment. This one always stands out to me, and I always am surprised that we don't correlate this to our own human experience. So if you have a fish tank, it's a very clean fish tank, beautiful, clean water. You toss a fish in there, and 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, the tank starts to get extremely dirty. Plants start to decay in it, and you're seeing the water is all brown and sluggish, and it looks gross. And you start to notice that your fish is looking unhealthy. We have two options here. You can either medicate and vaccinate the fish, or you can clean the tank. What do you think is the better answer? Because I feel like if you have a dirty environment, a dirty fish tank, that's going to lead to an unhealthy fish. And the best thing to do to make that fish healthy again is to clean the tank. And I think most of us would agree. But I'm so surprised that we don't think about our own health and our own human experience just the same. We get sick. We live in an extremely unhealthy and toxic environment, just like we went over in the last episode, from the food we eat, to the people we visit, to the things we listen to the things we put on and around our bodies, all the different things. But yet we get symptoms of illness, or as I call symptoms of healing, and we reach for a medication or we reach for a vaccine. It really baffles me and surprises me. So I want to go and start into these 10 ways that the medical cartel misleads us. Number 1, acute inflammation. As a physical therapist, assistant, and personal trainer, I see this all the time, especially in the PT clinic. You have an acute ankle sprain. And acute means short term. So a very recent ankle sprain, and that ankle blows up with swelling. It gets really warm to the touch, extremely swollen, and you go to the doctor, and what do they tell you to do? They tell you to ice the injury, and they tell you to take anti-inflammatories and something to manage the pain. Now, there's a lot of new studies that have come out that show that the acute inflammation is actually the body's natural healing response. That inflammation around the ankle is there to provide a natural cast and cushion to protect the injured ankle. And it's bringing vital nutrients and blood flow to the area in order to heal the injury. Now, We take an anti-inflammatory or ice that injury, and what are we doing? We are suppressing the healing response of our body. This is something I would see in the PT clinic all the time. Somebody's hurt, ice it. Why are we doing this? We need to get up with the science. We need to understand what our body is doing. And what our body is doing is healing itself. It's just very sad that the medical establishment has weaponized our own healing responses and convinced us that they're diseases or that they're symptoms of illness or something that needs to be medicated and stopped immediately. So, number one, acute inflammation. We do not need to ice acute inflammation. Obviously, if we are dealing with chronic inflammation, that is an entirely different ballgame and it will be addressed differently. Number two, cortisone shots and surgeries for musculoskeletal injuries. As a physical therapist assistant, I feel like I have a place to talk about this. I see it all the times with things like IT band syndrome, for instance. There's probably a lot of women watching this video that have struggled with hip pain, whether it be IT band pain, pain down the lateral side of the leg, pain in the hip when laying on the side of your hip. That may be what they call hip bursitis, which is when the bursa on the side of the hip gets inflamed, very often because the IT band is tight and pulling and pushing and creating friction on that bursa on the side of the hip. And what happens when you go to the doctor? They recommend a cortisone shot or they recommend a surgery to lengthen that IT band without actually teaching you what the cause of IT band syndrome or an inflamed bursa is. And very often, without going into too much detail, many of us, and I find this in most of my assessments, my movement assessments that I do with my clients, is there's a lot of hip and core instability and weakness. So when the posterior and lateral muscles of the hips are weak, the front muscles like the TFL or the quads tighten, which create tension and tightness in those IT bands. And what do the doctors do? Like we said, they inject cortisone or they lengthen the IT band. And what could we do to actually address the cause of this problem? We can strengthen and stabilize the posterior and the lateral side of the hips and stabilize the core. And then the muscles that are attached to the IT band can relax because now they're not having to pick up the load for the posterior hip muscles, and the IT band loosens up. It stops creating friction and pressure into the bursa of the side of the hip, and magically pain reduces. I've helped countless clients do this, and yet I have people, and I hear people all the time struggling with hip bursitis and IT band syndrome, and they immediately rush for a surgery, and they immediately rush for a massage therapist or a chiropractor or cortisone shots, when simply strengthening the right areas is the way, and improving your overall movement quality is the way to actually get to the root of this without medical intervention. Number three, gluten intolerance. And I'm also going to get into a little bit of lactose intolerance here. So I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this who struggle with gluten intolerance or celiac disease. And what that is there's a protein that's found in grains that some of us have been shown to be intolerant to. It creates all kinds of gut dysbiosis or imbalance in our gut, which is extremely uncomfortable for people. But we're being misled here. What's really happening is it's glyphosate poisoning. So there's pesticides and herbicides that are sprayed all over our grains that are being grown in extremely toxic environments. And we're being poisoned after we eat these grains. We're being poisoned by glyphosate, and then our body is rejecting it, thank God, and detoxing us and expelling these poisons and these toxins from our body. And it shows up as gluten intolerance. And then we're told not to eat anything with gluten in it. And, there may be some truth to that, but the problem isn't the gluten itself. The problem is what's being sprayed onto our gluten. That is the problem. So that's a big one. And that's something that we're really seeing on the rise right now, as we're seeing the rise of these herbicides and pesticides being sprayed by Monsanto and all these other extremely corrupt organizations through big chem. And then lactose intolerance. This is a big one for me because I'm a big milk guy. And I have spent so much time disembodied. I've spent so much time outside of my body, which may seem very weird to many of you, but I think you guys could relate, where you don't even realize what certain foods, what certain environments do to your body because of how disembodied we are. So disconnected from our own vessels. And I spent so many years like that, shitting my pants after I would eat any kind or drink any kind of dairy. And it wasn't until I discovered raw dairy, raw milk, raw cheese, that I realized that maybe it's not lactose. Maybe I'm not lactose intolerant. Maybe what's happening through pasteurization and homogenization of our dairy products is they're killing the healthy bacteria and the enzymes in our milk and dairy products, which help to break down the dairy products and help us actually absorb it as nutrients into our body. And what does our body do as a way to detox us? Is shit our pants, throw up, the whole nine. Many of us get stuffy nose, a lot of congestion. This is another way that our body detoxes from toxic dairy. But the problem isn't the lactose. The problem isn't the dairy. It's the processing of the dairy through pasteurization and homogenization, where they are killing the bacteria and enzymes that are actually healthy for us. And we have no reason to fear that. And we'll get into that later. But that's the actual problem. We need those things in our dairy in order to be able to digest it and utilize it as medicine, as nutrients. Number 4, this is a big one. I pray that you will keep an open mind to what I'm saying. And I advise that you do your own research on everything that I'm saying. I am not a medical doctor. I have done a lot of research and a lot of work on myself and helped countless clients work through many of these things that I'm talking about. But please don't just take my word as the gospel. Please do your own research. With that being said, number 4, and a very I would say controversial topic here is the medical establishment has convinced us that chemical imbalance is the cause of mental health disorders. And this one really gets under my skin, because as somebody who has struggled with ADHD, who struggled with depression at times, who struggled with addiction and anxiety and a host of other things that would be considered mental health disorders, obviously, when I look back at those times in my life, I was living a life and living in an environment that was not conducive for my health. And it led to massive amounts of stress on my body in all levels. So of course, if you test my brain chemistry, it's going to be off, because I was in a toxic relationship, working a job that I hated, eating shitty food, putting shitty products on my body, and a host of other things. My body is so stressed, living in the fight or flight response. And you're telling me that the reason I'm anxious, the reason I'm depressed is because I have a chemical imbalance? It has nothing to do with the fact that I'm living a life that's making me fucking miserable? Come on. That's a big one. And I know it's gonna touch on a lot of people. And I just ask you to sit with it and keep an open mind. This is where we get into the cause versus correlation. Of course, when we're in a stress state, when we're dealing with anxiety and depression, we are gonna have brain chemistry that is off. But that does not mean that it is the cause of our mental health issues. It's correlated because it's present when we're in distress, but it's not the cause. And when you're dealing with mental health disorders, what do the doctors give you? They give you SSRIs or serotonin inhibitors, which increase our serotonin production. But what the medical establishment doesn't tell you is that 90 to 95% of your serotonin is produced in your gut. So through cleaning up your diet and reducing stress on all levels, you will have a more healthy gut, a more balanced gut, which will allow you to produce more serotonin so you do not need these drugs that will lead to so many more problems down the road. They will suppress emotions that are leading to distress, but it's through dealing with those emotions and allowing them to surface and move through your vessel that you will find true healing. Number 5, high blood pressure. This is a big one. We see people who are extremely stressed on all levels of their life who go to the doctor and are tested for high blood pressure. And what do the doctors most likely do? I'm not saying all of them, but what do they most likely do? They will give you medication to reduce your blood pressure without talking to you about the stress on your body, without talking to you about stress management, mental health, diet, relationships. How's your work? Do you enjoy what you do? Do you have purpose? All these things. If you don't, and if you're overly stressed, of course you're going to have high blood pressure. You're living in a chronic fight or flight response. But that does not mean that you simply need a medication. And we're crazy to think that if we take a medication for high blood pressure, that does not disrupt. You cannot change the heart without impacting the lungs and the liver and the gallbladder and all these different things. If you're a car mechanic and you're listening, if I'm totally not a car guy, so I'm going to sound like an idiot talking about it. But if you increase, force production through a certain area of the motor and you don't have other, mechanisms in place in order to handle that, then you're going to create a whole lot of disturbance within that car. And that's the same thing with our body. We have something going on with high blood pressure. We take medication for it, and then we end up with a host of other symptoms. And then the medical establishment continues to feed us more and more drugs, which makes us more and more sick. And now we're a client forever. When in all reality, if we really got to the root cause of the high blood pressure, we would realize that it's most likely stress on a host of different areas of our body. Number 6, very similar, but a different organ, different area. There's a lot of people out there dealing with hypo or hyperthyroidism. I see this all the time. I came across the post the other day of a friend talking about how she was having a hard time sleeping. And I saw a woman comment on it. Have you ever had your thyroid tested? I found out that I had hypothyroidism, and that was what was leading to, my lack of sleep and a host of other things. And yeah, you may have hypo or hyperthyroidism, but that doesn't mean that it's the cause of why you're not sleeping well. If you are living in a chronic fight or flight response, in that sympathetic dominant response, your blood is out into your extremities, preparing you to fight or flight, because your body doesn't know the difference between whether the stress is coming from your job or your relationship, or if it's a tiger chasing you. So why would your thyroid do what it needs to do if you are running away from a tiger or in a miserable relationship? There's no difference there. Of course, your organs are not doing what they're meant to be doing. So if the medical establishment tests that, they're going to say, look, you have high blood pressure, you have hypothyroidism, but that does not mean that the thyroid itself is the problem. The problem is that you're living in a chronic state of stress and your organs are not doing what they're meant to be doing. So instead of reaching for an immediate pill to help with the thyroid function, let's take a look at our stress. Let's take a look at our life and what we have control over that may be leading to chronic stress, that may be leading to our thyroid not functioning properly. 7, another big one and really hits home for me, gallbladder and tonsil removals. We literally remove organs that are not functioning properly or that are causing symptoms of illness, symptoms of healing. You have gallstones, likely due to a host of stress. And I'm going to continue to reiterate on it, but food, stress on all different levels are going to lead to disturbances with our organs. But to just chop them out and get rid of them is completely asinine to me. This doesn't mean it's a death sentence if you don't have your tonsils or your gallbladder, but looking back in retrospect, how ridiculous. Look at your diet, look at your stress, what was going on in your life at that time. Likely there was a whole lot of poor diet, lack of exercise, and a whole lot of stress on all levels that led to things like gallbladder, gallstones and different things. I remember when I was younger, kids were always getting their tonsils removed, but they were also coming in eating ring dings and freaking Jolly Ranchers for lunch. So of course we're living in houses with toxic building material and all these things that we're ingesting, toxic candles. Of course, the tonsils, which are your first line of defense, are going to be inflamed and there's going to be issues with them. But to just cut them out, to cut out the first line of defense of your body is just completely asinine. Your body makes no mistakes. We just need to listen to our bodies, and we need to do what we can to find balance, to reduce stress, to get out of that fight or flight response and more into that parasympathetic rest digest response so our organs can repair, rest, and do what they're meant to do. Number 8, we have addiction is genetic and incurable. That's a big one for me. As somebody who has struggled with drug addiction, this one really hits home for me. It is not my belief in any way that I am a victim to my genes, that I am a victim to my addiction because people in my family and generations past struggle with addiction. That is not how I view it. I take radical responsibility over my life, and I view addiction as, specifically for me, drug addiction, as a solution to a deeper problem. I am grateful for the fact that I had drugs at that time, because God only knows what would have happened to me or what I could have done to myself at a time of such distress for me. And I know it may seem ridiculous because, how bad was your life, but truthfully, for me, drug addiction, drugs were a solution to a deeper problem. I had no ability to regulate my emotions. I had no ability to cope with my life and my life circumstances. So what did I do to numb myself from that? I used drugs. I used alcohol. I use sex and codependent relationships to numb myself from a dysregulated nervous system. And now that I have done tremendous work on myself, I am much less dependent on substances and people, places, and things outside of myself in order to numb myself. I can now better cope with my reality. I can now better cope and handle and process my emotions, so I don't need to reach for drugs and alcohol. And I see where you could think that there is a genetic component to this, because maybe your father or your mother or your grandmother and your father also struggle with drug addiction. But more than likely, they also struggle with emotional maturity, and they also struggle to regulate their nervous system. So what better way to deal with that than drugs, alcohol, sex, and codependent relationships, gambling, and a host of other things that are no different from drug addiction. So it is my personal belief that addiction is not genetic and it is not incurable, and it is a solution to people's deeper problems. But they don't want you dealing with the deeper problems. They want you dealing with the symptoms, so then they can medicate you and profit off of you forever. And this is why it's so important that we transcend victim consciousness and move into a reality of radical responsibility, where we take radical responsibility over our lives and get to the root cause of our problems so we can live a life of abundance that we are all deserving of. Number 9, mold is not the cause of disease. The medical establishment, the medical cartel, convinces us that mold causes disease. I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. There was a massive double-blind placebo study that was done in 2024 that pumped massive amounts of mold and spores of mold into people. Through the air, through their nostrils, through their mouth, every which way, and they could not produce symptoms of illness or disease. What they found was that when your home is extremely humid, toxic building materials will release things like formaldehyde. It's been shown in the houses that were built that most of us live in, they're built with very toxic building materials. And when that house becomes humid, like change of seasons, which is why many of us get sick during certain times of the year, that these toxic building materials release chemicals and release these toxic materials that actually have shown to cause disease, things like formaldehyde and asbestos and assortment of other things. And the mold is present because it's breaking down or degrading the toxic building material. Why is it that when you walk in the forest and you walk outside for a hike and you see mold all over the trees, and yet it's healthy for you? You don't get sick from that, but you get sick from the mold inside your house? It's not the mold. The mold is a solution. The mold is the breaking down, the eating away of the material, the decomposing of the toxic building material. But what's actually making us sick is the toxic building material. But they don't want you to know that, because they use the toxic building material that makes us sick, that then they can medicate us for and create massive amounts of profit off of us. So this is the difference between cause and correlation. And this is why it is so important that we take a deeper look at things and really understand, is this the cause of my symptoms and my disease? Or is this correlated? I have been sick. I live in a cottage on Patchogue Pond, and my house, I did not get a dehumidifier this year until about a week ago. Me and Cheyenne were dealing with respiratory and stuffy noses for like a month. Now we can sit here and say, yeah, I got a virus, I got a bacteria from somebody, it came from a germ, or it's the mold, because I see mold in the windowsills of our house. But it's not the mold. It's not viruses. It is the toxic building material that's being heated up due to the humidity and increased temperatures without my AC in, that's leading to me having to then detox and expel this building material, which presents itself as symptoms of illness, like a fever, a runny nose, all these different things that we are so quick to say came from somebody else or came from something like mold. So really understanding the difference between cause and correlation. And the last one, and I saved it for last because it's the most controversial and probably the hardest one to understand, is we have been so deeply conditioned to believe that viruses and bacteria cause disease. Once again, going back to that fish tank, if you have a fish in a sick tank and a dirty environment, that fish is going to get sick. And if there are two fish in there together and they both end up with the same symptoms, is it accurate for us to assume that one of this fish got sick from a virus or a bacteria from another fish? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say that the problem was the fact that they are both living in a toxic environment, in a dirty, toxic fish tank, and that's what's creating the detoxification symptoms that presents itself as symptoms of illness, or as I say, symptoms of healing. I'm not going to go too deep into this as far as viruses and bacteria not causing disease. However, many of you maybe resonated with 1, 2, maybe 9 of the ways that the medical cartel lies to us, but you're looking at me totally like a moron right now because I'm saying that viruses and bacteria don't cause disease. But I have done massive amounts of research on this. I follow many doctors and scientists and virologists that are saying the same exact thing. You guys have seen me post about this and talk about this for the last 4 or 5 years. The reason that we say that viruses and bacteria don't cause disease is because a virus by itself has never, ever been fully isolated and shown to cause disease. And I know that may seem ridiculous to you guys because you're saying, yeah, well, I got sick from COVID. Yeah, well, my daughter had chickenpox and she was around somebody else and they got sick with chickenpox. Or, I was holding my little niece and she had a runny nose and she sneezed on me and then I ended up with the same symptoms, a day later. But until you fully isolate something, you cannot say that that something causes another something. This is the root of virology, and this is how they use cause and correlation to convince us of illness without proof. And most virologists, even if you're watching, you're going to tell me that I'm a complete quack. And you're going to say, well, look at this study. Please show me a study where a virus of any kind has been fully isolated by itself and reintroduced to a healthy being and shown to cause disease. That study it's not out there and it's never been done. And that goes for all viruses. And it comes down to Koch postulates. And what Koch postulates is it's a set of 4 things that need to be done in order to prove viruses. And the first one is the microorganism is found in abundance in a sick host and not found in a healthy host. So that's the first part of Koch postulates to prove virus isolation and causation of disease. Number 2, that microorganism must be isolated fully and grown in a pure culture. So it has to be fully isolated. That does not mean that you take snot from a sick host and you introduce it to antibiotics and bovine serum and a host of other things. That's not virus isolation. You have to isolate solely the virus. Number 3, the isolated microorganism must cause disease to a healthy host. So now, if you have fully isolated that virus, you reintroduce it to a sick host, and they have to be sick with the same set of symptoms. And that's number 4. The microorganism must then be re-isolated and identified as being identical to the original microorganism found in the first sick host. This has never been done and completed for any virus ever. So we cannot sit here and talk about how viruses and bacteria cause disease if they have never, ever been fully isolated. When I was detoxing from drugs after almost 10 years of drug addiction, I finally came off the drugs for the last time. And what did I have? Flu and cold symptoms. Many of you have probably had food poisoning or withdrawn off of some kind of medication and had flu and cold symptoms. Does that mean that I got the drug withdrawals from a friend standing next to me? Absolutely not. And can anybody actually prove that they got sick from somebody else? It's easy enough to give a hug to a friend who has a stuffy nose and then end up with a stuffy nose and said, yeah, I got it from Betty because I hugged her yesterday. But can you actually prove that? No. But what we do know is that many of us who get sick with the same symptoms are living and visiting the same areas. Me and Cheyenne ended up with the same set of symptoms just a month ago. But that doesn't mean that we caught it from somebody else. It means that we are living in a house with toxic building materials. We let the house get way too humid, so the building materials heated up. Also, my diet isn't always on point, and a host of other things that probably led to stress that led to detoxification symptoms that show up like cold or flu symptoms. So there are so many other reasons that we get sick in clusters when we are eating the same things, visiting the same places, dealing with the same toxins in all areas of our life. And that's why it's so important to really transcend that victim consciousness that we are, victims to our genes, that we are victims to germs and viruses. We have to transcend that paradigm and shift into radical responsibility, where we take responsibility over our lives on all levels in order to find harmony and balance. And that's what I'm really hoping to bring forth with this podcast and with Path to Self Wellness, is a new way for healthcare, is a safe space for people to come together to do the healing work, to find harmony, to find abundance that we are all deserving of. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope this lands, and I pray that you will continue to tune in with an open heart and an open mind. Thank you guys so much, and always remember, face yourself to free yourself.